Alrighty, this week we are talking about fingerprints. Uh-oh, I want my screen to advance. There we go. All right, so fingerprints, little things right there. Look at that, fingerprints. Ooh. All right, so fingerprints. The skin that makes up the palm of our hands is very different from the skin on the rest of our body. And when you take a look at the palm of your hands, you'll notice that the skin has got some ridges. And you also notice that you typically have a distinct lack of pigment compared to the color on the rest of your body. Now, granted, the middle of winter, and when I'm recording this, so I'm pretty pale. But you know, if you're kind of tan, you'll notice you don't get as tan on your palm as you do on the back of your hand. Got hair follicles back here, no hair follicles here. So this skin here on the palm is called the volar skin. It's a very different skin from the rest of the body. And there's a couple of different skins across our body. Our skin is one large organ, but each section of that organ has some different responsibilities. Now the purpose of this volar skin is this. As I'm holding this pen, as you can see, I've got it my thumb and index finger, but I'm not squeezing down it. I mean, I can just pull it out. Versus if I start squeezing down on it, I can't pull it out very easily. So it's kind of like the treads on a tire or the treads on the bottom of your shoe. That by having those little ridges, by having those impressions, what we end up with is the fact that those little ridges create friction, and so then I can hold this and I can shake it and it doesn't fall out of my hand. Versus if I didn't have those, this would just go, when I shake my hand, this would just go fall right out. Now, basically, what are the fingerprints as it relates to what we find at crime scenes? So we're talking about the fingerprints here on our finger. What about the fingerprints we find at the crime scene? That is the oils, the perspirations, any residue you pick up, skin cells that have flecked off, that when I touch a surface, those are left behind. That Lacard's exchange principle. Anytime you have contact with something, there will be some kind of exchange. So we've got the raised up part, and we've got the lower part, the hills, the ridges, the valleys, the furrows. And that forms the actual print pattern that will be left behind on a surface. Now the patterns that our skin has are arches, loops, and whorls. These are the three most common patterns. And when we look at them, you can see the whorls are basically a bunch of circles. And at parts of the circles, we basically down here have, you have your finger where you've got the actual finger part. There's lines that go back and forth, and when you get up into the fingerprint area, it's where it starts to make the whorl. So down here, the print pattern just is going left and right, and when we get actually here into the whorl, notice right here you've got this little triangle looking shape, and right here we have a triangle looking shape. That's referred to as a delta. Arches, again, it's just going back and forth. When we get up into the tip of the finger, we end up with a pattern where the print comes in from the one side, goes up, and then just drops back down. Typically, you don't see a defined delta in an arch. There can be what we call a tented arch, where the pattern becomes very triangular. That will have a delta. And then we have our loops, where the print pattern comes from one side, goes up, and then goes right back the other side. And as you can see right here, we've got ourselves that triangle or that delta. Some other patterns that we typically see will be a double loop. These are not as common as those first three patterns. So the double loop, we've got down here the back and forth going on, and where the print pattern begins up at the fingertip, the print lines come in from one side, they start to go up, they loop over, and then they loop back over again. And so we end up with this delta down here, we end up with a delta up here, and we end up with basically the centers of these two loops. Something else you can have is a loop that's so big where at the middle of the loop you end up with a whorl or a central pocket loop. Back and forth down here, as we get up in the tip of the finger, the print pattern comes in from one side, goes up, goes down, goes out the other side, but that loop is so big, in the middle here we end up with a whorl. Got a delta there, got a delta there. So that is what we're looking at. Now, the way the fingerprint people do these comparisons is the first thing they do is classify arch, loop, whorl, or one of the other common classifications that aren't quite as common as arch, loop, or whorl, and then they start going from there. So they'll start looking at, like, say, what's the distance from the delta to the center, how many lines are there, and they start looking at the print patterns, like you can see here where it splits in two and it bifurcates, etc., etc., etc. Now, as it relates to that volar skin, this happens when we're in utero, when we're developing in mommy's belly. we have interaction with our environment. And so as we're having that interaction with our environment, that causes our fingerprints. Our fingerprints are not locked into our DNA. Our DNA says there will be volar skin here, but it doesn't say what the pattern will be. So we can have identical twins, same DNA, completely different fingerprints, completely different fingerprints. Now, some of these points of minutia are the things that we're comparing. So there's our delta, and we can count the distance from the delta to the core. We can take a look at the fact that you can actually see the pores of the skin here. You can see like a little dot or an island. You can see where the ridge lines split into two, which is a bifurcation. You can see where they crisscross over each other. You can see where a ridge just ends, bifurcations, again, islands, some dots. Two ridge lines connect together to make a bridge, so two parallel lines have a line that connects the two. Sometimes we can not have that connection, so it just becomes a spur. They can bifurcate and then come back together right away, called an enclosure or an island. They can bifurcate multiple times in a row, so we can have double, triple, quadruple bifurcations. Then we can end up even with a trifurcation where the line goes straight and then it also bifurcates at the same time. Now, some of the kinds of prints that we find at our crime scenes. One that folks don't think about too often is called a plastic fingerprint. And a plastic fingerprint is when you've got a soft material at the crime scene, say the caulking on the edge of a window in the heat where it gets kind of putty-like. Back in the days where we had lots of bar soaps, bars of soap would sometimes be used by criminals at the crime scene. They'd wash their hands, believe it or not. Putty, tar, etc. Wet paint even, really thick, viscous wet paint on the surface. That when I leave my fingerprint in that surface, it creates a three-dimensional image. You know, basically like if you take a block of Play-Doh and you put your fingerprint in it, you'll be able to see your print very, very distinctly. Patent prints are also ones that are right there, right in front of us for us to see. These are the ones made in oil or blood. So if somebody attacks me or I attack them and I get blood on my hand and now I touch the surface in my environment, so I touch the wall here and I take my hand away and there is that bloody fingerprint right there. That is a patent print. It's right there. We don't have to do anything to see it. All we have to do is take a photograph of it. Same with our plastic prints. It's right there. We can see it. All we really have to do is make it so that we can photograph it a little better. Latent prints are the ones that a lot of people think about. The fact that right now I'm touching this counter here, and when I take my hand away, there's a set of fingerprints there. You can't see them. I can't see them, but they're right here. All we have to do is get out the powders and the brushes and dust them, and then we find those prints, which is what we'll talk about in the next video. We have limited recording time here, so I'm going to end this video now, and the next video we will pick up in how we search for and find the different kinds of fingerprints.